Well, this morning I'm continuing the series, The Heart of the City. And as you know, in this series we've been asking some questions and talking about these, thinking deeply, I hope, about the answers to these questions. Who are we? We've asked. Who is our neighbor? And what is God calling us to do? Those are the three we've asked so far. Today may be an even more challenging question, and that is, what's ahead? What's ahead? That's a tough one. I mean, the honest answer, really, for me or for anyone else is, I don't know. We don't know what's ahead. It's always a challenge to try to even think about that. The Apostle Paul used an image in 1 Corinthians 13 that might escape us today because we're not familiar with a framework for viewing past and future that was common in Paul's day and his culture. And that is the idea that the past is in front of us and the future is behind us. Just the opposite way that we think of it, isn't it? But if you think about it, it makes sense because I can look at the past and I can see it pretty clearly. And moving into the future, I'm moving like this because I don't know what's ahead in the future. And so that's the image Paul has in mind when he says, for now we see in a mirror dimly. So the image is, Paul is holding up a mirror to see the future. That's the only way you can see it. And mirrors, keep in mind, in Paul's day were made of metal, polished metal. And so you couldn't see very far with one of those mirrors. You could see dimly. So now we see in a mirror dimly as we move into this future. That's the image Paul has for us. And we know it's true that we see the future dimly at best. And when we try to predict the future, we're often spectacularly wrong. In history, there are a lot of instances of that. You may have heard some of these. I wanted to share a few of them with you because they remind us that when it comes to the future, we see as in a mirror dimly. Here are some quotes for you. I think there is a world market for maybe 5 computers. Thomas Watson, the chairman of IBM, said that in 1943. Where a calculator on the ENIAC is equipped with 18,000 vacuum tubes and weighs 30 tons, computers in the future may have only 1,000 vacuum tubes and weigh only 1.5 tons. Popular Mechanics, 1949. While theoretically and technically television may be feasible, commercially and financially it's an impossibility, said Lee DeForest, inventor. We don't like their sound, and guitar music is on the way out, said Decca Recording Company, rejecting the Beatles in 1962. A Yale University management professor wrote on a project, the grade C, and wrote these words: the concept's interesting and well-formed, but in order to earn better than a C, the idea must be feasible. The author of that project, Fred Smith, who was proposing reliable overnight delivery service, and he went on with that C grade and founded Federal Express Corporation. Who the heck wants to hear actors talk, said H.M. Warner, Warner Brothers Movies in 1927. Radio has no future. Heavier than air flying machines are impossible. X-rays will prove to be a hoax, said William Thomson, British scientist, 1899. It will be years, and not in my time, before a woman will become prime minister, said Margaret Thatcher in 1974. The list is long of predictions that just didn't quite work out because we see the future as in a mirror dimly. In fact, those experts would really be upset to know that the Jetsons probably had a better track record of predicting the future with flat screen TVs and household robots and all the rest. dog walking treadmills and everything. Now we see in a mirror dimly when we try to peer into the future. And so what I want to do is we think about what's ahead, that question for us. I want instead to look back for a moment at those who came before us. These are the people that the writer of Hebrews calls a great cloud of witnesses. That text from Hebrews begins with the words, so that. Now that tells us something went before. So that, he begins. In the translation that I know by heart, he begins with therefore, which always tells you something else came beforehand. And what came beforehand was this litany listing all of these people of faith who stepped out on faith and trust. And then he says, so therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, and that's who I want to talk about for just a moment, the cloud of witnesses. These are the people who went before us. He was talking about, the writer of Hebrews was talking about those people of faith that we're all familiar with. I'm talking about the people of faith in this church community who went before us. The image that guides me in my thinking about that is the image of a journey. That's a great image because everybody's on the move in the Bible. Abraham and Sarah going to inherit a new land, and Moses leading the people out of slavery in Egypt through the wilderness, and Jesus leading his disciples all around as he taught and as he healed and as he ministered to people. He led them across the Sea of Galilee over into Gentile territory, people with whom they would not normally have rubbed shoulders. He led them up through Samaria to rub shoulders with the Samaritans as well. Always on the move, the Apostle Paul and his cohorts going throughout the Roman Empire to spread the good news. And those who came before us in our congregation, in our church, also always on the move. It all began that journey did in 1853 with a little Methodist society. They met in homes. They met sometimes in the Masonic Lodge that was on Weatherford Street. And that was in 1853. 20 years later, in 1873, they decided it was time, if they were really going to love God, serve people, transform lives in that community, make disciples of Jesus Christ, that they needed some better tools to do that. And one of those tools was a building. And so they determined to build a building. Now, 1873 is an important year in American history because it was the year of the Great Panic of 1873. The Great Panic of 1873 was an economic panic. It was a severe depression. Wall Street was closed for 10 days, the market was, because of this severe downturn. And yet those who were part of that great cloud of witnesses built that building anyway. They needed $750 to build it. They wanted to have 5 pledges in hand before they started construction on that building. They had 4 of those pledges, and they went to a man named Gerald Mulkey to get the 5th pledge. The building committee visited him. And he said, you know, if you put all my worldly goods together, they amount to about $25. But he said, I'll make that pledge. And I will pay it with my work. See, Gerald Mulkey worked in a planing mill. And so he gave his labor, he gave $100 worth of labor to cutting and planing all the lumber that would go in that wood frame building, the first building at 4th and Jones here in Fort Worth. And then came 1887. 1887, at the height of the worst drought in Texas history at that point, when people who had moved out here from the east, many of them moved back to the east because of the conditions here. Fort Worth was in a world of hurt. And it was in that year that those who went before us on this journey of what is now First United Methodist Church, they bought property, they got their first full-time pastor, and they decided they needed to build a bigger structure. They moved the old structure. They built a brick building on that site. They added to that brick building 4 years later. during that drought. What a crazy thing to do. In 1890, the church changed its name to First Methodist Episcopal Church South. That's what the denomination was called at that time. And then they got landlocked. In 1908, they opened a new building at 7th and Taylor Street. Beautiful big new building, and they got landlocked again. And then on October 29th, 1929, you know the date, stock market crashed. That's the day they broke ground on this facility in which we sit now, and they went ahead and built it. Now that journey is not all about buildings. And when I say these were people on the move, I'm not really talking about moving from one location to the other, which they did. And that was courageous, that was forward thinking, that was visionary for sure. But I'm talking about the movement of the people in reaching the needs of the community for Jesus Christ, in witnessing to the gospel in word and deed. Union Gospel Mission, All Church Home for Children, United Community Centers, First Street Methodist Mission, First Congregation on radio in 1922, television in 1975, internet in 2004. Over and over again, not just in buildings, but in programs, and certainly not just moving physically. We've been in this location for 88 years, and because of the foresight of those who went before us, who bought every piece of property that ever touched this property, that ever became available, because they never wanted to be landlocked again, we're in this place, but we're still moving. We're still moving. Now that's the great cloud of witnesses that has gone before us. It's a great image, that image of the great cloud of witnesses. Today's Super Bowl Sunday, so this is a good way to visualize it. Imagine a stadium that's full of people, and those are the cloud of witnesses. Those are the ones who've gone before us. We're surrounded, Hebrews said, by this great cloud of witnesses, and they're all looking down at people who are in the game. That's you and me. They're on the edge of their seats, they're cheering, they're wondering, what are they going to do next? What's going to happen now? They're pulling for us. That's the great cloud of witnesses that Hebrews envisions, those who've gone before us. It's a powerful image to think about that. We're in the game now. Anyone who's ever invested anything or read a prospectus, you know that there is a warning that's always present, right? You know the warning? The one that says past performance does not guarantee future results. It's a good one for us to hear. Because as we think about what's ahead, it's easy for us to look back and think how great that was and what vision they had, and isn't that wonderful? And the way it's been is the way it's going to be, and everything will just be great because past performance guarantees future results. No, it doesn't. It doesn't. There's a story about a psychic who had a crystal ball that was supposed to be perfect. He could foretell the future, and he never got it wrong. And a man went to see him and said, "I only have one question. I want to know when my life will end." And the psychic looked in the crystal ball and said, "Your life will end when you die." Well, no wonder he always got it right. And so he asked the question then, but will I be happy? And that's when the fortune teller said, that's not a question about the future. That's up to you in the present. That's pretty good. Because really, we're the ones in the game now. And with that question, what's ahead? The answer to that question is, well, what's ahead is what is dependent on what you do, what we do together as a faith community right now in this part of the journey that is First United Methodist Church. Someone after the last service gave me a quote. I don't remember who they said it, but I thought it was really good. They said that the way to predict the future is to invent it in the present. That's pretty good. It's the present that really enables the future, that calls it ultimately into being. What's ahead is really up to us. You know, if you went back to 1968 and asked the question, who will be in 25 years the leading manufacturer of watches in the nation? Everybody would have said, well, Switzerland. I mean, they had 65% of the market at that time, 90% of the profits. And then came the invention of quartz technology. In fact, oddly, invented by the Swiss. But they didn't adopt it. It was too different. It didn't have the mechanism. It didn't have the winding stem. It didn't have all the things you would expect. And so a company called Seiko adopted that technology. And by 1980, they had 10% of the world market in watches. Because, what's the saying? Past performance does not guarantee future results. See? So it really has to do with what we do in the present. That question, what's ahead, really is a question that we have to answer by the actions we take now and what we do now. We're the ones who are on the playing field, surrounded by a great cloud of witnesses at this point. And we're the ones who are called to be faithful. We're the ones who have to have a vision. We're the ones who have to do the hard work. We're the ones whose responsibility it is now. We're the ones who are on the journey, and it's in our hands. And so what does that mean for us? Let me suggest a few things very quickly. One is that it means we keep moving. That's what we do. Now, I don't mean that we're going to move to another location. Because of the foresight of those who came before us, we're not going to have to do that. No, I mean, we keep moving forward as a community of faith. We keep moving forward in a way that's faithful and that continues to reach people for Jesus Christ, that continues to be an instrument of transformation and new life in our community and our world. We continue to do that because we have to keep moving. I don't believe there's any such thing as a faith community, a church that stands still. I don't think it's possible. I think you're moving. You're always going to move. You're going to move in one direction or another, but you're going to be moving. So it's up to us. When we think about what's ahead, well, we're going to keep moving. We're going to do that. And then our call, secondly, is to dream beyond what we believe is possible. To dream beyond what we believe is possible. That's not an easy thing to do. To really stretch beyond what we really believe is possible and to dream beyond that point. The planners of New York City, when they laid out the city, they had about 6 or 7 numbered streets. They started in the middle and they numbered them, 1st Street, 2nd Street, and so forth. They had 6 or 7. And in their planning, they went all the way to 19th Street because they thought that would be as big as the city would grow. There's a 271st Street in New York City. They couldn't possibly imagine that. It was difficult for them to dream that far. But our call as a community of faith is to dream farther than beyond what we believe to be possible, really. And the third thing is that we plan. And we plan not just for what's right on us, but we plan for what is to come, and we plan for generations into the future. The best story I know about that is from Oxford University, the new college at Oxford. Because at some point it was new. It's certainly not now. But the new college when it was built a magnificent dining hall with huge oak timbers. Generations later, those oak timbers were infested with the death watch beetle. And it was clear that they would have to be replaced. But where in the world would the finances come from to do that? Where would you find oak trees massive enough to do that? And when you found them, which you could certainly do someplace, how would you afford them? That was their dilemma. And as they were talking about it, the university forester, because there is one, even to this day, who manages the vast amount of land they have, university forester heard the conversation and said, "Well, we thought you would never ask." What? Yeah. He had an answer for them. The answer had been passed down from forester to forester to forester to forester because they had planted generations earlier a grove of oak trees exactly for the purpose of replacing those beams which they knew one day would have to be replaced. And when the time came, they were ready. That's planning. That stretches us. That helps us prepare for what is to come, because it's not just dreaming beyond what we think is possible, but it's planning for a future that God has in store. And that brings me to the last point, and perhaps the most important, I think the most important. And that is, we move forward, but we move forward motivated not by fear, but by faith. We're people who trust God. And what motivates us is not fear, but faith. You know the old maps that cartographers made when the New World was discovered, before the New World was discovered, and afterward too. Maps that had vast blank areas where they didn't know what was there, and so the cartographers, in their imaginations, would draw dragons or sea serpents or fiery scorpions, and they would write inscriptions like, "Here be serpents, here be fiery scorpions, here be dragons," because it was unknown territory. And there's a fear of the unknown territory, and it's a good thing that the explorers didn't stop with their fear, but they stepped forward with a different kind of confidence. Jürgen Moltmann, the theologian, wrote a book called Theology of Hope, and in it he said, as Christians, we are first and foremost a people of hope, constantly moving into the future that God has for us. That's who we are. We're not motivated by fear, but instead motivated by faith, trusting in God for that future. One of those maps I mentioned fell into the hands of a British explorer in the 1800s, and he scratched through all of those inscriptions, "Here be dragons, here be fiery serpents," and all those. And he simply wrote in that place, "Here be God." That's the word for us. God. What lies ahead? God. We know that. We may see in a mirror dimly, but that, as people of faith, we can see clearly. When we go from this place today, we're going to take the scripture with us from Hebrews, and I'm going to quote it as I learned it, different translation, where the writer of Hebrews says, listen again to the words, "Therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight," or baggage, the translation said, that Roy read a moment ago, "every weight and sin that clings so closely, and run with perseverance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of our faith." That's the word that takes us into the future. Amen.